Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. The Russian Empire in the 18th century stretched farther than most people could imagine. Forests rolled endlessly toward frozen horizons, rivers carved silent paths through wilderness, and cities rose like islands of stone amid vast plains of snow and mist. In winter, the air itself seemed to pause, as though the land were holding its breath. Far away from the warm courts of Western Europe, this enormous empire lived by its own rhythm, slow, powerful, and often mysterious. At the heart of this empire stood the imperial court, a world of glittering halls, whispered alliances, and hidden rivalries. Here, beneath chandeliers and painted ceilings, decisions were made that could change the fate of millions. Yet for all its grandeur, the court was rarely a place of peace. Power in Russia had always been uncertain, and the throne itself seemed to rest on fragile ground. Emperors ruled with authority, but behind them moved generals, nobles, advisors, and rivals, each with ambitions of their own. In such a world, the difference between loyalty and betrayal could be thinner than a sheet of winter ice. As you settle in to listen to this sleep story, a like and a subscription are a quiet way to support this channel. And if you feel comfortable, you're warmly invited to share where you're listening from in the comments. Into this distant and complicated empire arrived a young girl who was, by every expectation, unremarkable. She was not born in Russia. She did not speak the language of its people. Her family possessed neither great wealth nor powerful influence. To most observers, she seemed like countless other minor European princesses whose lives would pass quietly in the background of history. Yet history has a habit of hiding its most dramatic turns within the most ordinary beginnings. The girl who stepped onto Russian soil had traveled a long way from the modest German principality where she had spent her childhood. The journey itself was a passage into an unfamiliar world. The climate felt harsher, the customs stranger, and the court far more intimidating than anything she had known before. Around her stood nobles who had lived their entire lives within the traditions of the Russian Empire. Their language flowed rapidly, their manners followed rules she barely understood, and their expectations weighed heavily upon every gesture she made. Yet something about the young princess set her apart from what people first assumed. She watched carefully. She listened more than she spoke. And behind her quiet composure lay a mind that was constantly learning, absorbing the strange new world around her. Where others might have felt defeated by isolation, she began to adapt. Still, few people at the Russian court imagined that this foreign girl could ever hold real power. The empire already had its rulers, its heirs, and its ancient traditions. Thrones were not easily claimed by outsiders. To many nobles, she was simply a guest within a system far older and stronger than herself. If she had any role at all, it would likely remain small and predictable. But the court of Russia was never as stable as it appeared. Beneath the elegance of ceremonies and royal banquets moved a quiet undercurrent of uncertainty. Alliances shifted. Loyalties changed. And sometimes, in moments when the balance of power trembled, unexpected figures stepped forward. The young princess could not have known exactly what fate awaited her when she first arrived. Yet even in those early days, there were subtle signs that her story might unfold differently from the lives of those around her. She possessed patience where others had impatience. Curiosity where others showed indifference. And perhaps most importantly, she carried a quiet determination that few noticed at first. Years later, that determination would reshape the destiny of the Russian Empire itself. For the same foreign girl who once struggled to understand the language of her new home would one day stand at the center of its power. She would rise not simply as a royal consort or distant noblewoman, but as the ruler of the entire empire. And when that moment finally arrived, it would not come with thunder or public spectacle. Instead, it would unfold quietly, almost silently, within the guarded walls of the imperial court. A throne would change hands, an emperor would fall, and the young princess who once seemed insignificant would emerge as the new sovereign of Russia. But long before she became known as Catherine the Great, she was simply a girl standing at the edge of a vast and unfamiliar world, unaware that history itself was slowly turning in her direction. Yet the story of this future empress did not begin in the grand halls of Russia, nor in a palace filled with glittering chandeliers and guarded corridors. It began far away, in a small city that few outside Northern Europe would have recognized at the time. Long before she would rule one of the largest empires in the world, she was simply a child born into a modest branch of European nobility. The girl who would later become Catherine the Great entered the world in the Prussian city of Stettin, a quiet port town resting along the cold waters of the Baltic region. Compared to the immense capitals of Europe, Stettin was small and unremarkable. Ships moved slowly along its harbor, soldiers marched through narrow streets, and ordinary life unfolded with little expectation that anything extraordinary might emerge from its walls. Yet it was here, in 1729, that Sophie Friederike Auguste was born. Her family belonged to the minor nobility of the German states, a network of small ruling houses scattered across Central Europe. Titles and traditions surrounded them, but their influence was limited. Sophie's father served as a military officer and governor, respected but far from powerful. Her mother possessed strong ambitions for her children, yet even she understood the boundaries that their modest rank imposed. In the complicated hierarchy of European royalty, there were families whose names carried enormous weight, and others whose place in history seemed destined to remain quiet and peripheral. At first glance, Sophie's childhood appeared ordinary for a young noblewoman of her time. She lived within castle walls, received lessons from tutors, and learned the manners expected of someone born into aristocratic society. But unlike the glamorous courts of powerful kingdoms, the household she grew up in lacked extravagance. Resources were limited, and daily life was shaped more by discipline than by luxury. Yet within this modest environment, something distinctive began to take shape in the young girl's character. Sophie was curious in ways that surprised those around her. While other children might have been satisfied with simple lessons and routine expectations, she displayed an unusual eagerness to understand the world beyond her immediate surroundings. Books fascinated her. Conversations between adults captured her attention. Even small observations about politics, culture, and human behavior seemed to spark questions in her mind. This curiosity was not loud or dramatic. She was not known for bold speeches or rebellious gestures. Instead, her intelligence revealed itself quietly, through careful listening and thoughtful reflection. It was the kind of mind that absorbed details others overlooked, storing them away for reasons that would only become clear much later. At the same time, Sophie grew up in a world where personal choices were often limited by political necessity. Across Europe, royal and noble families rarely arranged marriages based on affection alone. Instead, unions between houses were carefully designed to strengthen alliances, secure influence, or maintain delicate balances of power between rival states. A princess was not merely a daughter within her family, she was also a potential bridge between dynasties. From an early age, Sophie understood, perhaps more clearly than many children, that her future might be shaped by decisions far beyond her control. Conversations about diplomacy, inheritance, and political connections floated through the rooms of her home. Even when she did not fully grasp the details, she sensed the quiet expectations forming around her life. Yet rather than shrinking beneath those expectations, Sophie seemed to grow steadily stronger in her resolve. There was a patience in her personality, a willingness to adapt and learn from whatever circumstances might arise. Where others might have felt constrained by the limitations of their birth, she appeared to accept them calmly while continuing to develop her own abilities. What made this contrast remarkable was how little anyone at the time suspected what she might eventually become. To the outside world, Sophie Friederike Auguste was simply another minor German princess. Her name carried no particular fame. Her family's position placed her far from the centers of European power. If observers had tried to predict her future, they would likely have imagined a quiet life spent supporting a husband within some distant noble household. History, however, often hides its most significant transformations within lives that seem ordinary at first. The very qualities that made Sophie appear unremarkable, her patience, her attentiveness, her ability to adapt, were slowly shaping a character far more resilient than anyone realized. Even her mother, ambitious as she was, could not fully foresee how events might unfold. She hoped for a respectable marriage for her daughter, perhaps one that might improve the family's standing within the complicated network of European courts. Such hopes were common among noble families, and few would have considered them unusual. But the political world of the 18th century was constantly shifting. Alliances formed and dissolved. Empires searched for stability through strategic marriages. And sometimes, unexpectedly, the fortunes of lesser-known families intersected with the ambitions of much greater powers. It was within this unpredictable landscape that Sophie's destiny slowly began to change. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Stettin, decisions were being made within royal courts that would soon reach into her life. Powerful figures in distant capitals were considering alliances that required suitable brides from noble houses across Europe. At the time, Sophie continued her studies and daily routines, unaware that her future was quietly being discussed far beyond the walls of her family's residence. She could not yet know that the path ahead would lead her far from the familiar world of her childhood. Soon, an invitation would arrive that would alter the direction of her life completely, an invitation that would carry her across borders, into the heart of a vast empire, and toward a destiny no one in Stettin could possibly have imagined. Soon, the quiet life Sophie had known in Stettin began to shift in ways that neither she nor her family could fully control. The political winds of Europe were moving once again, and somewhere far beyond the modest walls of her childhood home, powerful figures were searching for alliances that might strengthen the future of their empires. In the intricate world of royal diplomacy, marriages were often the threads that tied nations together. And one such thread was about to reach across the continent and touch the life of a young German princess who had never traveled far beyond her familiar surroundings. The invitation arrived with an air of both opportunity and uncertainty. The Russian Empire, vast and formidable, was seeking a suitable bride for its young heir to the throne. For Sophie's ambitious mother, the proposal carried enormous promise. A marriage into the Russian royal family would elevate their position far beyond anything they had previously imagined. Yet the journey would not be simple. Russia was distant, its customs unfamiliar, and its court known for both grandeur and danger. For Sophie herself, the news brought a mixture of emotions she struggled to fully express. She was still very young, standing at the edge of adulthood, and the path unfolding before her felt both thrilling and intimidating. Leaving the land of her childhood meant stepping into a future where nearly everything would be unknown. Yet beneath the uncertainty stirred a quiet determination. She had always shown a willingness to adapt, and now that ability would be tested in ways she had never experienced before. The journey eastward took her farther from the comfortable world she had always known. The landscape itself began to change as the miles passed. Towns grew fewer, forests stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, and the cold air of the northern region seemed sharper than anything she remembered from home. Travelers spoke of the Russian Empire with a mixture of awe and caution, describing a land both powerful and unpredictable. It was not merely another kingdom among many, it was a realm so large that its borders seemed to fade into the edges of the map. When Sophie finally approached the imperial court, she entered a world where ceremony and politics blended together with almost theatrical intensity. The palaces were magnificent, their halls decorated with golden accents and towering windows that reflected the pale northern light. Courtiers moved through the corridors in carefully arranged hierarchies, each gesture and word measured according to traditions that Sophie had yet to fully understand. Among these unfamiliar faces stood the young man whose future would soon become tied to her own. The heir to the Russian throne, Peter, was a figure who puzzled many around him. His behavior often seemed unpredictable, shifting between enthusiasm and indifference in ways that confused those who expected the calm authority of a future emperor. Some courtiers viewed him with skepticism, while others treated him cautiously, aware that one day he would hold the power to shape their fortunes. For Sophie, meeting Peter marked the beginning of a relationship that was far more complicated than she had anticipated. Their personalities differed sharply, and the emotional distance between them quickly became apparent. Yet she understood that the expectations surrounding their union extended far beyond personal feelings. The marriage was not designed for comfort, it was designed to secure the future of the Russian throne. At the same time, Sophie faced another transformation that was equally profound. In order to fully enter the Russian royal family, she would need to leave behind many elements of the identity she had known since birth. Language, religion, and even her name would change as she adapted herself to the traditions of the empire that was preparing to accept her. Learning the Russian language proved to be one of her earliest challenges. Its sounds and rhythms differed greatly from the German words she had spoken throughout her childhood. Yet she approached the task with remarkable dedication, practicing tirelessly until she could speak with growing confidence. Where others might have grown frustrated, she pushed herself harder, recognizing that understanding the people around her would be essential if she hoped to survive in such a powerful court. Religion presented another important step in her transformation. To become part of the Russian imperial family, Sophie converted to the Orthodox Christian faith, a decision that symbolized her commitment to the empire she was joining. During the ceremony that marked this change, she received a new name, Catherine. The moment carried both ceremonial beauty and quiet significance. With that name, she began to step away from the identity of the German girl who had once lived quietly in Stettin. Yet adopting a new name did not instantly erase the challenges she faced. Catherine, as she was now known, remained a foreigner in a court filled with individuals who had grown up within Russian traditions. Conversations sometimes shifted into tones she struggled to interpret. Political alliances formed and dissolved in ways that were difficult for an outsider to predict. Even the simplest gestures could carry meanings that only experience could reveal. Despite these obstacles, Catherine continued to observe everything around her with the same careful attention that had defined her childhood. She studied the customs of the court, listened to the conversations of nobles and advisors, and gradually learned how power moved through the corridors of the empire. The process was not easy, and there were moments when isolation must have weighed heavily upon her. But each challenge seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than diminish it. What few people realized at the time was that these early struggles were shaping the qualities that would later define her rule. By learning to adapt, observe, and endure within a foreign environment, Catherine was slowly building the resilience that life at the Russian court demanded. And though her transformation from Sophie into Catherine had already begun, the most difficult chapters of her story were still ahead. For the marriage that awaited her would soon reveal tensions no one could easily ignore, and the quiet ambitions growing within the palace would eventually reshape the fate of the empire itself. The early days of Catherine's marriage revealed challenges far more complex than she had anticipated. Though the union had been arranged to strengthen dynastic ties and secure the future of the Russian Empire, the reality of sharing life with Peter soon exposed a profound mismatch. At first glance, Peter seemed like any other young nobleman thrust into a position of power, yet beneath the surface lay a personality that would test Catherine's patience and resilience. He was impulsive and unpredictable, often retreating into eccentricities that left those around him bewildered, while his moods swung with little warning. The contrast between his erratic temperament and Catherine's careful, measured nature quickly became apparent. From the very beginning, emotional distance grew between them. Peter seemed largely indifferent to the demands of marriage, focusing instead on his own pleasures and interests, while Catherine approached her new role with the seriousness of a student and observer. She understood that entering the Russian court meant more than simply occupying a title, it required skillful navigation of both social and political currents. But Peter's inattentiveness often left her to face the intricate web of court expectations alone, creating a sense of isolation that weighed heavily upon her. At court, Catherine observed the subtle tensions that simmered beneath polite conversation and formal ceremonies. Nobles scrutinized one another with cautious eyes, and whispers of ambition and rivalry floated through gilded halls. Every gesture, every word, carried potential meaning. As she watched, Catherine learned to interpret these signals, developing an awareness that would become a key tool in her survival and eventual ascent. The young empress in training realized that understanding human behavior could be as important as mastering language or etiquette. Meanwhile, Peter's behavior began to draw increasing criticism from the court itself. His decisions often appeared careless or self-indulgent, and his disinterest in governance alarmed those who expected a strong and capable heir. His unpopularity grew steadily, making Catherine's position both precarious and paradoxically advantageous. As Peter faltered in the eyes of nobles and advisors, Catherine quietly absorbed the lessons hidden within the turmoil. She devoted herself to the study of Russian culture, politics, and the philosophical currents that had begun to influence European governance. In private, she read works by enlightened thinkers, exploring ideas about leadership, authority, and the responsibilities of rulers. This period of observation and learning was essential to Catherine's development. While others mocked or dismissed her husband, she focused on acquiring the knowledge and understanding that would one day allow her to govern effectively. She noted the mistakes Peter made, the ways in which indecision could weaken authority, and the importance of public perception in maintaining power. Each failure she witnessed became a lesson, each misstep a cautionary example. Through contrast, between Peter's impulsiveness and her own careful study, she sharpened the instincts that would later guide her through far more dangerous challenges. Yet despite her growing awareness, Catherine was not untouched by the isolation surrounding her. She navigated a foreign culture, lived in a palace filled with intrigue, and shared a life with a husband whose indifference often left her alone in the labyrinth of political expectation. Moments of loneliness were compounded by the subtle pressures of a court where every smile and bow could mask ambition or resentment. To outsiders, Catherine may have appeared composed, but inwardly, she grappled with the quiet anxieties of a young woman far from home, surrounded by a world whose rules she was still learning to master. In the midst of these challenges, Catherine found ways to assert her own identity within the constraints imposed upon her. She cultivated alliances with sympathetic members of the nobility and sought out individuals whose counsel could illuminate the workings of the court. She observed military leaders, ministers, and influential families, noting the ways in which loyalty and power intersected. Through these careful studies, she began to form a picture of Russia not as a distant abstraction, but as a living, breathing entity shaped by people, politics, and circumstance. Peter's growing unpopularity also created a subtle but significant opportunity. While the young heir often alienated his advisors and courtiers, Catherine's keen attention to detail allowed her to develop relationships built on trust and shared understanding. She became a figure who, though still new and relatively powerless, was increasingly aware of the levers that governed influence. Every encounter at court became a test, a whispered observation, a careful response, a strategic gesture that slowly built her insight into the mechanics of authority. At the same time, Catherine continued to refine her understanding of the intellectual world. She studied the works of European philosophers, exploring the ideas that had begun to shape governance across the continent. These lessons were not merely academic, they provided her with a mental framework for interpreting the often chaotic and unpredictable behavior of those around her. Where Peter acted impulsively, Catherine considered consequences. Where nobles maneuvered for advantage, she studied the patterns. Where the court seemed indifferent, she observed underlying motivations. Her mind became a tool as sharp as any blade, honed through careful attention to the interplay of people and power. Despite the isolation, the challenges of marriage, and the often unkind scrutiny of the Russian court, Catherine's resolve continued to grow. She realized that survival, and perhaps more, would require a combination of patience, intellect, and careful observation. The contrast between her husband's recklessness and her own deliberate cultivation of knowledge highlighted not only the weaknesses of those around her but also the strength she could bring to bear when the moment arrived. In this tense and uncertain environment, Catherine's ambitions remained quiet but undeniable. Each day in the palace taught her more about the dynamics of power, the fragility of authority, and the subtle ways in which influence could be gained and maintained. The lessons were often painful and sometimes isolating, yet they gradually shaped a mind capable of navigating one of Europe's most complex and formidable courts. By the time she had spent months within the walls of the imperial palace, Catherine had begun to understand the stark reality of her position. The marriage she had entered, arranged for political convenience, was fraught with tension and emotional distance. Yet the very difficulties she faced provided the crucible in which her character and strategic awareness were being forged. What might have seemed like misfortune to others became for Catherine an invaluable education in power, perception, and patience. And as the young Empress-in-waiting quietly studied her husband, the court, and the empire itself, she was unknowingly laying the groundwork for a future that would astonish everyone around her. Each observation, each lesson absorbed in silence, edged her closer to a destiny that would not merely follow the expected path of a royal consort, but instead lead her to become one of the most powerful rulers in European history. The tension, isolation, and contrasts of her early marriage were only the beginning of a story that would soon unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The Russian imperial court, as Catherine quickly discovered, was a world unlike any she had ever known. Its glittering halls, adorned with crystal chandeliers and golden accents, concealed more than elegance, they hid webs of ambition, secrecy, and subtle danger. Every conversation, every smile, and even the smallest gesture could carry hidden meaning. The young Empress-in-waiting began to realize that the court functioned as both stage and battlefield, a place where appearances were carefully maintained while power shifted constantly behind closed doors. For someone unfamiliar with the nuances of Russian aristocracy, missteps could prove disastrous. To survive, and to rise, Catherine would need to observe, learn, and act with precision. From the moment she entered these corridors of influence, Catherine noted the careful hierarchies that governed interactions. Noble families vied not only for titles and favor but for the chance to influence the future of the empire itself. Alliances were often as fragile as they were strategic, forming quickly in response to opportunity and dissolving just as suddenly when circumstances changed. To navigate such a labyrinth required subtlety and foresight. The ability to anticipate motives and detect hidden agendas became more valuable than any ceremonial knowledge or formal courtesy. Catherine's prior experiences, her patience, her attentiveness, her understanding of human behavior, now became essential tools. Even as she learned to move among the courtiers, Catherine observed the empire itself. Russia was vast, a land of staggering breadth and diversity. Its cities, rivers, and forests stretched beyond the imagination, encompassing a range of cultures, languages, and traditions. Power in Russia was not concentrated solely in St. Petersburg or Moscow, it radiated across provinces, where governors, military leaders, and local nobility wielded authority that could rival the influence of the court itself. The challenges of governing such a sprawling domain were immense, and Catherine began to grasp the complexity of an empire in which geography, culture, and politics intersected in unpredictable ways. Within the palace, the tension was constant. Catherine noticed the subtle power plays among key figures, where loyalties were tested in whispers rather than proclamations. A noble might smile graciously during a gathering yet undermine a rival's reputation through discreet counsel behind closed doors. Military leaders, too, were attentive to the shifting sands of influence, knowing that their positions could rise or fall depending on the whims of those closer to the throne. Every gesture and word carried significance, and Catherine quickly learned that appearances could deceive as much as they revealed. Her observations sharpened her awareness of both opportunity and risk. Despite the dangers, Catherine began to build relationships that would serve her in the years to come. Some nobles recognized her intelligence and composure, offering subtle guidance or cautious support. Military officers, initially indifferent to the young foreign empress-in-waiting, began to notice her quiet presence and attentiveness to the empire's needs. These early connections, though tentative, laid the groundwork for alliances that could one day provide both influence and protection. Catherine understood that in a court filled with shadows, relationships were currency, often more valuable than titles or wealth. The young empress also recognized that the court itself was only a microcosm of the larger forces shaping the empire. Russia's political landscape was influenced not only by the court's intrigues but by pressures from beyond its borders. Neighboring nations, regional uprisings, and shifting alliances demanded vigilance and strategic thinking. Catherine saw that governing such a diverse and far-reaching realm required more than inherited power, it required intellect, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the motivations of those who held influence at every level. While Peter continued to draw criticism for his unpredictable behavior, Catherine quietly observed the weaknesses in both her husband and the court. His impulsiveness often created openings for others to assert their own agendas, and Catherine took careful note of which figures could be relied upon, which could be persuaded, and which posed potential threats. Her attention to these details was not conspicuous. She spoke little, watched much, and allowed others to underestimate her. In doing so, she preserved her position while steadily increasing her understanding of the forces at play around her. Through these early years in the palace, Catherine learned to interpret subtle signals, the inflection in a voice, the timing of a gesture, the nuanced reactions during a discussion of court business. She developed an instinct for reading both intentions and vulnerabilities, which would later become critical in navigating the more dangerous political currents of her reign. Every day presented new lessons in strategy, patience, and self-restraint, reinforcing her growing awareness that power in Russia was rarely absolute. It was negotiated, maintained, and sometimes seized in moments that required both courage and precision. The court also offered Catherine glimpses of the broader cultural and intellectual life of the empire. She attended concerts, theatrical performances, and salons where ideas circulated quietly among those who shaped policy and taste. These experiences were not merely diversions, they allowed her to understand how culture intertwined with politics, how prestige and perception could be as influential as military or financial might. Catherine's curiosity and intelligence enabled her to absorb these lessons quickly, forging connections between knowledge, influence, and the subtle currents of power. Yet even as she moved carefully among the courtiers, Catherine remained conscious of her position as a foreigner and a young woman in a male-dominated political environment. Her outsider status could easily have rendered her vulnerable, but she transformed it into an asset. Observing from the periphery allowed her to notice details others might overlook, to recognize opportunities that insiders, blinded by familiarity, might miss. The contrast between her quiet presence and the often brazen displays of ambition around her sharpened her understanding of influence and control. In this environment of intricate alliances and quiet rivalries, Catherine's awareness deepened with each passing day. The court was filled with shadows, where ambition often hid behind polite smiles, and where danger could emerge in the form of subtle maneuvering rather than open confrontation. But within those shadows, she began to see the structure of power, the relationships, the weaknesses, and the unspoken rules that governed an empire capable of immense authority. Her observations were forming a foundation, a mental map of both opportunity and risk that would guide her when decisive action became possible. By the time Catherine had spent months navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the imperial court, she had begun to understand the stakes of power in Russia. Survival required more than compliance. It demanded insight, patience, and the ability to anticipate both ambition and betrayal. And in the midst of these lessons, the young Empress-in-waiting realized that the empire itself, with all its complexity and reach, was a stage upon which her own destiny might one day unfold. In the shadows of the court, she was quietly preparing for a future that no one yet imagined, one in which her intellect, resilience, and strategic acumen would position her not merely as a participant in history, but as a ruler capable of shaping it entirely. The passing of Empress Elizabeth in 1761 sent ripples through the vast expanse of the Russian Empire, a realm that had grown powerful yet fragile under her careful rule. Her death marked the end of an era, one in which authority had been exercised with skill, even if at times harshly. To those who observed the imperial court, the succession appeared straightforward. Her designated heir, Peter, would ascend to the throne. Yet even in this seemingly simple transfer of power, the seeds of instability were already present. The very traits that had made Peter a curious and often exasperating figure at court now threatened to unravel the empire's delicate balance. Peter's personality, long noted by Catherine and the court, was ill-suited for the demands of governance. He was impulsive, prone to erratic behavior, and easily swayed by personal whims rather than reasoned counsel. His approach to leadership lacked the discipline and strategic foresight that an empire of Russia's size required. In private moments, ministers and nobles whispered about his unpreparedness, exchanging anxious glances and murmured doubts. It quickly became evident that Peter's rise to the throne would not bring the stability many had hoped for. Instead, it exposed vulnerabilities that ambitious figures across the empire were quick to notice. Almost immediately, dissatisfaction began to mount. The military, which had long expected a firm hand at the helm, expressed frustration at the young emperor's erratic decisions. Orders were delayed, policies inconsistent, and a sense of uncertainty spread among those whose loyalty was essential for maintaining order. Soldiers who had served the empire for years found themselves questioning the judgment of the man who now held supreme command. What had once been routine obedience began to fray under the weight of Peter's unpredictability. Similarly, the court grew restless. Nobles who had once relied on clear hierarchies and predictable authority now faced a leader whose preferences seemed capricious and whose temperament inspired more caution than confidence. Alliances shifted as courtiers sought to secure their positions in the face of uncertainty. Some nobles openly criticized Peter's decisions, while others resorted to subtle maneuvering to protect their interests. Within months of his accession, the emperor's credibility had begun to erode, leaving the empire teetering on the edge of potential disorder. Even among the broader populace, the signs of discontent were apparent. Citizens of St. Petersburg and other major cities, accustomed to the relative stability of Elizabeth's reign, began to perceive inconsistencies in governance. Policies were implemented and then reversed. Appointments were made on whims rather than merit, and the spectacle of an emperor whose behavior was unpredictable created unease. Rumors and gossip flourished, further eroding confidence in the throne. What had been a smooth transfer of power now appeared fragile, vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. Catherine, ever observant, watched these developments with a mix of caution and calculation. The weaknesses of her husband were no longer private concerns, they were visible to the entire court and, increasingly, to the empire itself. Yet while others panicked or complained, she quietly absorbed the lessons presented by Peter's failings. Every misjudgment, every misstep, offered insight into the levers of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the ways in which authority could be maintained, or lost. The emperor's errors became a living tutorial in governance, strategy, and the subtle art of influence. At the same time, the emperor's unpopularity created opportunities that Catherine was uniquely positioned to recognize. While Peter alienated key figures through impulsive decisions and careless management, Catherine's calm demeanor and attentive nature allowed her to build credibility among the court's influential players. Military officers, nobles, and advisors increasingly saw her as thoughtful, intelligent, and capable, qualities that contrasted sharply with the emperor's erratic behavior. In these contrasts, the young empress-in-waiting began to understand how public perception could shape the balance of power. In a court where appearances often mattered as much as action, her quiet competence became increasingly visible. The growing instability also extended to the administration of the empire itself. Provinces relied on the clear guidance of a central authority, yet Peter's inattentiveness created gaps in governance. Decisions that required swift and precise action were delayed, leaving local leaders to navigate crises with little direction. In border regions and distant territories, where loyalty to the central authority was essential, the emperor's lack of foresight fostered unease. Observers began to recognize that the strength of the empire did not rest solely on armies or territory but on the perception of capable and consistent leadership. In this respect, Peter's reign threatened to undermine even the most secure foundations. Within the palace, tensions grew alongside the instability outside its walls. Courtiers, sensing both the emperor's weaknesses and the potential for change, engaged in increasingly subtle maneuvering. Alliances formed and shifted as individuals tested loyalties, hoping to position themselves advantageously should a crisis arise. In this environment, discretion was paramount, and even minor miscalculations could lead to ruin. Catherine's early lessons in observation, strategy, and patience became indispensable. She began to understand not only the dynamics of her husband's personality but also the vulnerabilities of the court, the empire, and the mechanisms through which influence could be exercised. As months passed, it became evident that Peter's leadership was not merely inconvenient, it was a potential threat to the stability of the entire empire. His lack of foresight, combined with widespread dissatisfaction among key players, created an atmosphere in which change was not only possible but increasingly likely. The stage was being set for a dramatic realignment of power, and the contrast between the emperor's instability and Catherine's growing competence could not have been clearer. Through it all, Catherine maintained a careful balance. She navigated the complexities of court life with prudence, forming discreet alliances while avoiding the appearance of ambition. She understood that any misstep could draw suspicion, yet she also recognized that the vulnerabilities surrounding her provided opportunities that required both patience and courage. In observing Peter's failings, she was quietly preparing for the moment when decisive action might become not only possible but necessary. By the time the cracks in Peter's authority had become visible to all, Catherine had already begun to cultivate the skills, relationships, and insight that would allow her to act when the opportunity arose. The empire teetered on the edge of uncertainty, and the young empress-in-waiting had positioned herself at the heart of the court, ready to navigate the treacherous currents of power. In this delicate balance, every day brought lessons in leadership, strategy, and human behavior, lessons that would soon converge in events that no one in St. Petersburg could have anticipated. The story of the emperor who lost the throne was, in truth, also the story of the woman who was learning to wield influence in his stead. While Peter's missteps exposed vulnerabilities, they also revealed the possibilities that could emerge from careful observation, patience, and strategic action. Catherine's understanding of these dynamics would prove critical in the months to come, as the stage was quietly set for one of the most remarkable shifts of power in Russian history. The air in St. Petersburg was thick with tension in the early months of 1762. Rumors of dissatisfaction, whispered in gilded halls and quiet corridors, had grown louder, and the emperor's failures had eroded the fragile loyalty of the court and military alike. Catherine, ever observant and patient, had watched these developments carefully, taking mental notes of allegiances, weaknesses, and ambitions. She understood that the time for quiet calculation had ended, the moment for decisive action was approaching, and with it, the possibility of reshaping the future of the Russian Empire itself. Catherine's preparations were meticulous. She knew that a direct confrontation with Peter could be disastrous if mishandled. His unpredictability, while a weakness, still carried the danger of impulsive retaliation. Thus, she focused not on force alone but on cultivating support among those whose influence mattered most. Among them were the Imperial Guard, soldiers whose loyalty was crucial to maintaining control in the capital. Many of these men had grown disillusioned with Peter's erratic leadership and were increasingly receptive to the promise of a ruler who could restore stability and prestige to the empire. The coup itself unfolded with a remarkable combination of speed and precision. In the quiet early hours, as the city slept beneath a winter sky, Catherine moved into action. Orders were given discreetly, troops positioned strategically, and the network of allies she had quietly nurtured over months became the instruments of change. By the time the streets of St. Petersburg were beginning to stir with the day's first light, the palace had already become a stage for one of the most dramatic transfers of power in Russian history. Peter, for all his flaws, did not resist with force or skill. Surrounded by those who had once pledged loyalty but now viewed his leadership with disillusionment, he was quickly overwhelmed by the organized precision of Catherine's supporters. Within hours, the abdication was secured. The young empress, who had spent years learning the subtleties of power, now stood at the center of authority in a city where every street, square, and hall would soon recognize the change. Her ascent was both sudden and inevitable, a testament to her patience, intelligence, and understanding of human nature. The atmosphere within the palace was tense, as courtiers and soldiers alike adjusted to the new reality. Some greeted Catherine with cautious admiration, recognizing her intellect and composure, while others remained wary, uncertain whether her rule would bring stability or spark further unrest. The contrast between the former emperor's erratic reign and Catherine's poised command was immediately apparent. She moved quickly to establish control, demonstrating both decisiveness and awareness of the delicate balance of power within the court. Almost immediately, questions arose about Peter's fate. His abdication left him in a vulnerable position, dependent on the mercy of those who now served his successor. The young former emperor was confined to relative isolation, a figure whose influence had been stripped away almost overnight. Yet the details surrounding his death, which occurred shortly thereafter under mysterious circumstances, would become a subject of speculation for years to come. Whispers of foul play circulated among courtiers and citizens alike, adding a shadow of intrigue to the dramatic events of the coup. For Catherine, the days following the transfer of power required both vigilance and strategic thinking. She understood that securing the throne involved more than removing a single obstacle, it meant consolidating authority across the empire. The Imperial Guard, loyal through the coup, needed reassurance, as did the nobility, who might have viewed the sudden shift with suspicion. Catherine's initial actions as ruler were marked by a careful balance of firmness and diplomacy, signaling her intent to govern with competence while mitigating the potential for rebellion or unrest. The coup of 1762 also highlighted Catherine's ability to capitalize on contrast and perception. Peter's weaknesses, once a liability, had created the opportunity for her rise. Where his impulsiveness had alienated allies, her measured approach won trust. Where his indifference to governance had left the empire vulnerable, her attentiveness projected the promise of stability. The psychological impact of this contrast resonated throughout the court and the capital itself, reinforcing the perception that Catherine was both capable and legitimate in her new role. Yet the transition was not without risk. A misstep, a misjudgment of loyalty, or a sudden shift in military support could have reversed her fortunes instantly. Catherine's awareness of these stakes informed every decision she made during the crucial days following the coup. Her careful attention to detail, each alliance strengthened, each potential threat neutralized, ensured that the shift of power, once initiated, would not collapse under the weight of unforeseen opposition. Beyond the palace walls, news of the coup spread rapidly through St. Petersburg and across the empire. Citizens, accustomed to the grandeur and ritual of imperial succession, witnessed a dramatic departure from tradition. The sudden replacement of an emperor with a previously untested ruler created both anxiety and fascination. Couriers carried word to distant provinces, where governors and local officials adjusted their expectations in response to the new political reality. The empire itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting confirmation that this extraordinary turn of events would indeed stabilize the state. In the midst of these turbulent days, Catherine's character and resolve became increasingly evident. She balanced authority with caution, intelligence with adaptability, and ambition with prudence. The skills she had cultivated over years of observation, study, and patient engagement with court politics now came to full fruition. The coup, while dramatic, was also a demonstration of her capacity for strategy, timing, and psychological insight. As the dust settled on the palace halls and St. Petersburg adjusted to its new ruler, the implications of the coup began to take shape. Peter, removed from power and soon dead under uncertain circumstances, was no longer the central figure in the empire's story. Instead, Catherine emerged as the focal point, a leader whose intelligence, poise, and strategic acumen would define the coming years. Her rise was sudden, but it was the product of years of careful preparation, observation, and patient cultivation of opportunity. The events of 1762 marked a turning point not only for Catherine but for the Russian Empire itself. The rapid abdication, the mysterious fate of Peter, and the immediate consolidation of power illustrated the delicate balance of authority in one of Europe's largest and most complex realms. Catherine's ability to navigate this pivotal moment would set the stage for her long and transformative reign, establishing her as a ruler whose influence extended far beyond the palace walls and into the very fabric of the empire. By the end of the coup, Catherine had transformed from a cautious observer into the sovereign of a vast empire, a position of power that few could have predicted when she first arrived as a young German princess. The streets, courtiers, and soldiers of St. Petersburg had witnessed a remarkable shift, a testament to her strategic mind, her patience, and her capacity to act decisively when the moment demanded it. And as she assumed the mantle of Empress, the stage was set for an era in which Catherine's intellect, ambition, and vision would reshape Russia forever, leaving an indelible mark on history itself. The coronation of Catherine marked a moment of both triumph and immense challenge. As the young empress stood beneath the gleaming domes of the Russian Orthodox Church, surrounded by gilded icons and the ceremonial grandeur befitting a ruler of one of Europe's largest empires, the weight of responsibility pressed upon her shoulders. The cheers of the court and the presence of the imperial guard provided outward signs of legitimacy, yet Catherine understood that true authority extended far beyond ceremony. The throne she had seized required more than loyalty from soldiers, it demanded recognition from an empire that was vast, diverse, and often skeptical of her right to rule. Catherine's first challenge was immediate, the question of legitimacy. As a German-born princess, her ascension had already sparked murmurs of doubt among the nobility, the military, and the populace. Many questioned whether a foreigner, someone who had not been born within the traditions and culture of Russia, could truly understand, let alone govern, the empire. Some courtiers openly speculated whether she would falter under the weight of her new authority, while others silently tested her resolve, waiting to see whether she could translate ambition into action. The perception of legitimacy, Catherine realized, was as crucial as the power she now held. Without it, even the strongest claim to the throne could unravel. From the very beginning, she approached her role with both strategy and care. Catherine recognized that the empire's stability depended on her ability to command respect and inspire confidence. She moved quickly to establish herself as a leader who understood both the grandeur of imperial tradition and the practical necessities of governance. Her speeches, her presence at court, and her interactions with ministers and military leaders were carefully calibrated to convey authority, intelligence, and decisiveness. Every decision, no matter how small, carried symbolic weight, signaling that the Empress was not merely a figurehead but a sovereign capable of shaping Russia's destiny. Yet authority in the Russian Empire was never guaranteed. The empire's vastness posed both practical and political challenges. From the icy reaches of Siberia to the bustling ports along the Baltic, governors and regional leaders wielded considerable influence. These officials, accustomed to a certain autonomy under previous rulers, would not yield unquestioned obedience to a young empress who had only recently arrived on the throne. Catherine understood that she needed to balance assertiveness with diplomacy, demonstrating both strength and prudence to ensure her policies were implemented across a realm of immense geographic and cultural diversity. Internally, the court remained a delicate arena. Many nobles, still wary of her foreign origins and her audacious rise to power, continued to test her authority. Catherine responded with a combination of tact and resolve. She cultivated loyal supporters, rewarding competence and discretion, while discouraging dissent through subtle demonstrations of influence. In these early months, she learned to navigate the intricate web of expectations, alliances, and rivalries that defined the imperial palace. The contrast between her careful deliberation and the impulsiveness of her former husband only reinforced the perception that she possessed the judgment necessary to govern effectively. At the same time, Catherine continued to expand her understanding of the empire itself. She met with military leaders, visited provincial governors, and studied the economic and administrative structures that underpinned Russia's power. Her curiosity, once a trait of the young Princess Sophie, now became a practical tool for leadership. She sought knowledge not merely for personal growth but to inform decisions that could strengthen her authority and improve the functioning of the state. In doing so, she cultivated an image of a ruler who combined intellect with action, a rare quality in a court accustomed to ceremonial figureheads. The challenges of foreign origin and legitimacy extended to the population beyond St. Petersburg. Citizens across Russia had grown accustomed to rulers born into the traditions of the empire, whose authority was intertwined with language, culture, and history. Catherine recognized the need to win public confidence not only through governance but also through symbolic gestures that demonstrated her commitment to the empire's prosperity and stability. Patronage of the arts, public ceremonies, and thoughtful engagement with influential figures all served to reinforce the idea that the Empress was invested in the welfare of her subjects. Yet authority was not secured by perception alone. Catherine faced the real and ongoing threat of political opposition. The remnants of her husband's supporters, rival noble factions, and ambitious courtiers all posed potential challenges to her rule. She understood that consolidating power required a careful balance. She could not act with unchecked force without alienating key allies, yet hesitation or weakness could embolden those who doubted her capacity. Each decision became a test of strategy, patience, and discernment, reinforcing the delicate nature of leadership in a court still adjusting to revolutionary change. Catherine also relied on her ability to read people, a skill cultivated through years of observing the court and understanding human behavior. She assessed loyalty, measured ambition, and identified both potential threats and opportunities. Her judgments were informed not only by intelligence but by psychological insight, recognizing that power depended as much on perception and persuasion as it did on formal authority. By mastering these dynamics, she gradually transformed initial skepticism into respect and cautious admiration. In these early months, Catherine's transformation was remarkable. From a young German princess navigating a foreign court, she became an empress capable of exercising authority over a vast and complex empire. She demonstrated that legitimacy could be earned, not simply inherited, and that leadership required a combination of intellect, decisiveness, and subtlety. Her ability to navigate challenges, anticipate threats, and inspire confidence marked the beginning of a reign that would be remembered not merely for its duration but for its profound impact on the Russian state and society. By the time the initial challenges of her coronation were addressed, Catherine had begun to secure her position as a ruler who could govern with both wisdom and authority. The initial doubts surrounding her foreign origins slowly gave way to recognition of her competence, strategy, and determination. In the process, she transitioned from a revolutionary figure who had seized power to a governing monarch capable of shaping the future of one of Europe's most powerful empires. The transformation was not instantaneous, but it was decisive, signaling the start of an era in which Catherine's intellect, leadership, and ambition would define not only the Russian Empire but also the broader trajectory of European history. Catherine's ascent to the throne marked not only a consolidation of political power but also the beginning of a profound engagement with ideas that were transforming Europe. Even as she navigated the complex machinery of governance, the Empress cultivated a mind attuned to philosophy, science, and the arts. The Russian Empire, vast and often rigid in its traditions, became a canvas upon which she could apply the principles of the Enlightenment, a movement that championed reason, education, and the pursuit of knowledge as tools to improve society and governance. Catherine recognized that true power extended beyond armies and decrees; it could also reside in ideas capable of shaping culture, policy, and the perception of authority. Her fascination with the intellectual currents of her time led her to form correspondences with some of Europe's most renowned thinkers. Voltaire, the French philosopher whose writings championed reason, civil liberties, and the critique of tyranny, became both a guide and a sounding board. Through letters, Catherine exchanged ideas on governance, justice, and reform, demonstrating not only her curiosity but her capacity to grapple with complex concepts that transcended national boundaries. The Empress, though ruling a conservative and often hierarchical society, sought inspiration from these dialogues to inform her own policies and vision for Russia. Another key figure in her intellectual circle was Denis Diderot, whose encyclopedic work represented the pinnacle of Enlightenment thought. Catherine admired Diderot's insistence on rational inquiry and the dissemination of knowledge. Their correspondence was rich with discussion of education, literature, and the role of the state in promoting enlightenment among its citizens. Catherine's engagement with these thinkers was more than ceremonial; she actively considered how their ideas could be adapted to strengthen her empire, foster civic responsibility, and cultivate a culture of intellectual curiosity. Back in St. Petersburg, Catherine began to implement these principles in ways that could be observed across the empire. She encouraged the development of schools, libraries, and institutions that would provide broader access to knowledge, aiming to elevate the cultural and intellectual life of her subjects. Literature and the arts were given patronage and recognition, transforming the empire into a center where creativity and learning could flourish. The empress understood that cultivating intellect was not merely an indulgence, it was a tool of governance, a way to inspire loyalty, cultivate enlightened thinking among the nobility, and gradually shape the values of society. The influence of Enlightenment ideas extended into Catherine's approach to law and administration. She sought to rationalize governance, streamline bureaucratic structures, and establish policies that reflected reasoned deliberation rather than tradition or caprice alone. In doing so, she signaled to both her advisors and the wider populace that her reign would be informed by principles of logic, fairness, and the pursuit of the common good. These reforms were subtle at first but carried profound implications for the operation of the empire, emphasizing clarity, consistency, and the potential for progress. Catherine's personal intellectual pursuits also reinforced her political position. By demonstrating a keen understanding of European philosophy, history, and statecraft, she cultivated respect among diplomats, scholars, and visiting dignitaries. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers projected an image of a ruler not only capable of wielding authority but also of engaging thoughtfully with the ideas that shaped the continent. This perception bolstered her legitimacy in the eyes of both domestic and foreign observers, reinforcing the notion that her reign was guided by intellect as well as ambition. Yet Catherine's embrace of Enlightenment ideals did not occur in isolation. The Russian Empire remained deeply hierarchical, and many courtiers were skeptical of change, particularly when it threatened entrenched privileges or traditional practices. Catherine balanced her intellectual ambitions with a pragmatic approach, advancing reforms that would modernize and improve governance while avoiding destabilization. Her ability to blend visionary thought with political acumen allowed her to implement ideas that were both progressive and sustainable, positioning the empire as a state capable of both stability and innovation. Through her patronage of education and the arts, Catherine also reshaped the cultural identity of Russia. She fostered the creation of theaters, literary societies, and academies that encouraged the exploration of philosophy, history, and science. These institutions became centers of influence where knowledge and creativity could flourish, extending the reach of Enlightenment thought beyond the palace walls. In doing so, Catherine not only elevated the intellectual life of her empire but also established a legacy in which the pursuit of knowledge was intertwined with governance and civic responsibility. Correspondence with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot also reinforced Catherine's sense of personal confidence and purpose. Engaging in debates on law, philosophy, and societal reform allowed her to clarify her own ideas and refine strategies for implementing reform. The Empress recognized that intellectual engagement could strengthen political influence, offering a way to guide the empire subtly through reasoned argument rather than coercion alone. Her engagement with these ideas demonstrated that leadership and intellect could coexist, creating a model of enlightened monarchy that contrasted sharply with the impulsive and erratic rule of her predecessor. The power of ideas, as Catherine understood, was inseparable from the exercise of authority. By embracing the principles of the Enlightenment, she began to transform not only the administration of the empire but also its cultural and intellectual climate. Her policies encouraged critical thinking, education, and artistic development, fostering a climate in which knowledge and creativity became tools for both social cohesion and political legitimacy. The Empress's engagement with philosophers and thinkers of the era signaled that her reign was not limited to the wielding of force but encompassed the shaping of minds, values, and institutions. By the end of this period, Catherine had established herself as more than a ruler who had seized power. she had become a sovereign whose intellect and vision extended across the empire and beyond. Her correspondence, reforms, and cultural initiatives demonstrated the profound influence of ideas in shaping governance, consolidating authority, and inspiring loyalty. Through her embrace of Enlightenment principles, Catherine revealed that the exercise of power could be both strategic and intellectual, laying the foundation for a reign in which reason, culture, and ambition converged to leave an enduring mark on Russian history. Under Catherine's rule, the Russian Empire transformed from a vast but unevenly managed state into a dominant power capable of projecting influence across Europe and beyond. The Empress understood that intellectual prowess alone could not secure Russia's place among the great powers. It needed to be reinforced by military strength, strategic expansion, and diplomatic cunning. The years following her coronation became a period of calculated campaigns, territorial gains, and the consolidation of authority, all of which signaled that Catherine's reign was not only one of ideas but also of tangible, far-reaching power. One of Catherine's earliest military challenges involved the Ottoman Empire, a centuries-old rival whose influence extended across the Black Sea and into southeastern Europe. Determined to secure Russia's southern borders and expand its access to key maritime routes, Catherine launched campaigns that tested both the resilience of her forces and her capacity for strategic leadership. Unlike her predecessors, she combined military action with shrewd diplomacy, ensuring that victories were leveraged to enhance Russia's geopolitical standing. Her generals, inspired by her decisiveness and clarity of purpose, executed campaigns that extended the empire's reach while demonstrating the strength of her command. The annexation of Crimea marked a particularly significant achievement. By securing control over this strategically vital peninsula, Catherine not only expanded Russia's territory but also gained a crucial foothold on the Black Sea. This acquisition allowed Russia to participate more actively in trade, influence regional politics, and secure a naval presence in a region that had long been contested. The triumph was more than military. It symbolized Catherine's ability to combine strategic vision with practical execution, turning ambitions into concrete outcomes that reinforced her authority at home and abroad. Meanwhile, Russia's involvement in the partitions of Poland showcased Catherine's capacity to manipulate both diplomacy and force to expand influence without overextending the empire's resources. By aligning with Prussia and Austria, she participated in a series of political maneuvers that ultimately divided the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, securing substantial territories for Russia. These gains were carefully calculated to enhance the empire's power while avoiding unnecessary conflict with neighboring states. Catherine's skill lay not only in conquest but in the subtle orchestration of alliances, ensuring that expansion was both sustainable and strategically advantageous. The expansion of the empire also had domestic implications. Each military victory, territorial gain, and diplomatic success strengthened Catherine's position within the court and the broader empire. Nobles who had once questioned her legitimacy now witnessed her capacity to project power and protect Russia's interests. Soldiers, inspired by decisive leadership and clear objectives, became more loyal and disciplined. The perception of strength reinforced her authority, creating a feedback loop in which success on the battlefield bolstered her influence in the palace and among the population. Catherine's approach to expansion was not purely martial. She understood the importance of integrating new territories into the empire, consolidating administrative structures, and extending cultural influence alongside political control. Schools, judicial reforms, and local governance initiatives were implemented in newly acquired regions to ensure that Russian authority was both respected and effective. In Crimea and the Polish territories, Catherine promoted settlement, trade, and infrastructure development, signaling that her empire was not only expanding geographically but also strengthening institutionally. The psychological impact of these campaigns on Europe was significant. Russia, once perceived as a distant and somewhat insular power, emerged as a dominant force capable of influencing the balance of power across the continent. Catherine's combination of military success and political acumen made her a respected, if occasionally feared, figure among European monarchs. Her reputation as a ruler who could seize opportunities and consolidate gains reinforced the narrative of her intellect and competence, extending her influence far beyond the borders of her own empire. Internally, the expansion underscored the effectiveness of Catherine's leadership style. Her careful observation of advisors, generals, and diplomats allowed her to identify talent and deploy resources efficiently. By balancing ambition with prudence, she avoided the overreach that had ensnared previous rulers, ensuring that each territorial gain contributed to the empire's long-term stability. Her ability to coordinate complex campaigns across vast distances demonstrated not only strategic foresight but also the capacity to manage the logistical and political challenges inherent in governing a sprawling empire. The campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, the annexation of Crimea, and the partitions of Poland also reflected Catherine's understanding of contrast and timing. She acted decisively when opportunities arose, exploiting weaknesses in rivals while presenting herself as both measured and enlightened in her approach. By juxtaposing military action with diplomacy, strength with intellect, she reinforced the perception that her rule was grounded in both wisdom and power. Each victory, while tangible in territorial terms, also served as a signal to allies and adversaries alike. Russia under Catherine was a state capable of both conquest and governance, reason and resolve. These expansions were not without challenges. Military campaigns required careful coordination, substantial resources, and the management of potential dissent within both the army and the civilian population. Catherine had to ensure that successes did not breed unrest or create perceptions of neglect in distant regions of the empire. Her attentiveness to these dynamics highlighted a sophisticated understanding of power, demonstrating that true expansion required not only conquest but careful integration, administration, and the cultivation of loyalty. By the end of these campaigns, the scale of Catherine's impact was undeniable. Russia had grown stronger, larger, and more influential than it had ever been, and the Empress's reputation as a strategic and capable ruler was firmly established. The combination of military success, diplomatic finesse, and effective governance underscored her ability to translate intellectual vision into real-world outcomes, proving that she could not only seize power but wield it with remarkable skill. The expansion of the empire under Catherine's leadership signaled more than the acquisition of territory. It demonstrated the scope of her political genius and the practical application of her authority. Through strategic warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and careful administration, she transformed Russia into a dominant European power. In doing so, Catherine reinforced her position as a ruler whose influence was both tangible and far-reaching, laying the groundwork for a reign defined by strength, vision, and enduring impact on the European stage. The stability of Catherine's empire, forged through conquest and careful governance, was tested in a way few could have anticipated. In the sprawling territories of Russia, discontent simmered among peasants, Cossacks, and marginalized groups who had long endured economic hardship, oppressive taxation, and social inequality. Their frustrations found a figurehead in Yemelyan Pugachev, a charismatic and cunning leader who claimed to be the deposed Emperor Peter III. With this claim, he rallied thousands to his cause, igniting a rebellion that threatened to unravel the empire Catherine had spent years consolidating. News of Pugachev's uprising arrived in St. Petersburg with a sense of urgency that sent ripples through the court. Courtiers whispered anxiously, military advisors debated strategies, and Catherine, though seasoned in political maneuvering, recognized the gravity of the threat. Unlike previous challenges, this rebellion was not a distant diplomatic issue or a localized military campaign. It was a direct challenge to her legitimacy and her authority. Entire regions were slipping from imperial control, and the empire's cohesion hung in the balance. Catherine responded with a combination of resolve and strategic calculation. She understood that the psychological impact of the rebellion could be as dangerous as the physical threat itself. If news of widespread unrest spread too quickly, it could inspire further insurrection, encourage disloyal nobles, or embolden external adversaries. Maintaining confidence in her leadership required both decisive action and careful management of perception. Her courtiers were tasked not only with mobilizing forces but with communicating the Empress's control, emphasizing that Russia's stability rested firmly in her hands. Pugachev's forces were unpredictable and ruthless. They struck with remarkable speed, exploiting the empire's vast geography and the vulnerabilities of remote provinces. Villages were overtaken, local administrators intimidated, and soldiers sometimes defected to the rebel cause. Catherine's commanders faced the challenge of coordinating responses across immense distances while anticipating the rebels' movements, which often exploited local grievances and strategic weaknesses. The empire's size, once an advantage in demonstrating power and reach, now became a complicating factor, making communication and coordination a formidable challenge. Despite the chaos, Catherine's leadership style proved decisive. She combined intelligence gathering, military strategy, and personal involvement in planning campaigns against the rebels. Generals were instructed carefully, with contingencies in place for unexpected developments, while Catherine herself remained closely informed of every advancement and setback. Her ability to integrate political insight with military planning demonstrated a mastery of governance under pressure. She knew that the rebellion was not merely a military challenge but a test of her authority, perception, and capacity to maintain cohesion across a diverse and sprawling empire. The rebellion also highlighted the power of psychological contrast in governance. Pugachev, presenting himself as a champion of the oppressed and a pretender to the throne, gained popularity among those dissatisfied with imperial rule. His image as a figure of hope for the marginalized contrasted sharply with Catherine's distant but orderly authority. The Empress understood that countering the rebellion required more than force, it required reinforcing the legitimacy of her rule, emphasizing the benefits of stability, and demonstrating the futility of rebellion against a capable and resolute sovereign. As campaigns against the rebels intensified, Catherine's strategic approach combined military action with reforms designed to address underlying discontent. Troops were deployed to key regions to restore order, while incentives were offered to loyal Cossacks and local leaders to reinforce allegiance. Administrators were instructed to correct abuses and ensure that taxation and labor obligations did not provoke further unrest. In these measures, Catherine displayed a blend of firmness and pragmatism, understanding that a purely punitive approach could exacerbate instability while a purely conciliatory stance might embolden the insurgents. The human cost of the rebellion was significant. Thousands of lives were lost in skirmishes and sieges, while entire communities faced displacement and disruption. Yet Catherine remained resolute, balancing empathy with authority. She recognized that demonstrating both justice and strength was essential to maintain confidence in her reign. Letters from generals, reports from governors, and her own observations informed a strategy that prioritized containment, suppression, and the restoration of order across the affected provinces. Over time, Pugachev's rebellion was gradually subdued through coordinated military campaigns and the careful management of local allegiances. The combination of decisive action, strategic planning, and psychological insight enabled Catherine to reassert control, reinforcing both the perception and reality of her authority. The rebellion, while a severe test, ultimately strengthened her position, demonstrating that she could not only seize power but defend it against threats that challenged the very legitimacy of her rule. The suppression of the rebellion also provided Catherine with insights into the empire she governed. She observed the grievances that fueled unrest, the loyalties that could be leveraged, and the vulnerabilities that required careful attention in the future. These lessons informed reforms in administration, military organization, and local governance, ensuring that the empire would be better prepared for potential challenges ahead. The experience underscored the interplay between authority, perception, and strategy, reinforcing Catherine's understanding of power as both an instrument and a responsibility. By the end of the Pugachev uprising, Catherine had weathered one of the most formidable crises of her reign. The rebellion tested her leadership, resilience, and capacity to navigate danger on a scale few rulers experienced firsthand. Her ability to maintain composure, integrate intelligence with action, and project both strength and legitimacy solidified her reputation as a ruler capable of managing crises with skill and determination. The empire, scarred but resilient, emerged from the upheaval more consolidated, and Catherine's authority, once questioned due to her foreign origins, was now reinforced by her demonstrated ability to lead decisively in the face of existential threat. In confronting rebellion, Catherine revealed the essence of her rule, a combination of intellect, strategy, and courage that allowed her to transform challenges into opportunities for consolidation. The Pugachev uprising, while chaotic and dangerous, ultimately highlighted her capacity to wield power thoughtfully and effectively, ensuring that the Russian Empire remained strong, unified, and prepared for the continued expansion and reform that would define the rest of her reign. As the years passed, Catherine's rule matured into a period of remarkable stability, achievement, and cultural flourishing. The empress who had once arrived in Russia as a young, foreign princess had transformed not only herself but the empire she governed. Under her guidance, Russia became a dominant power on the European stage, its influence stretching across continents, its military respected, and its territories expanded through both diplomacy and conquest. Yet it was not only in politics and warfare that Catherine's impact was felt. Her reign was equally defined by the cultivation of culture, education, and intellectual life, leaving a legacy that would endure long after her passing. Catherine's patronage of the arts was among the most visible and enduring aspects of her rule. She understood that culture could serve as both a reflection of power and a tool for shaping society. Under her encouragement, literature, theater, and music flourished in the empire's cities. She established institutions that would become cornerstones of Russian cultural life, most famously the Hermitage Museum, which began as a private collection but grew into a symbol of the empire's wealth, sophistication, and engagement with European ideas. Through these efforts, Catherine projected an image of Russia as a nation capable of intellectual and artistic achievement, reinforcing the prestige of her reign both domestically and internationally. Education, too, became a priority. Catherine introduced reforms aimed at increasing literacy and learning among the nobility and, to a lesser extent, among the broader population. Schools were established, curricula improved, and the study of science, philosophy, and literature was encouraged. She corresponded with leading European thinkers, maintaining a dialogue with the ideas of the Enlightenment and demonstrating that Russia could participate in the intellectual currents that shaped the continent. In doing so, Catherine positioned herself as an enlightened monarch, one whose authority was informed not only by power but by intellect, vision, and a commitment to progress. Despite the grandeur and intellectual achievements, Catherine's later years were also marked by the quiet realities of governance. Maintaining an empire of such immense size required constant attention to administration, diplomacy, and the careful balance of interests among nobles, military leaders, and provincial authorities. Yet she approached these challenges with the same clarity, decisiveness, and strategic insight that had characterized her early reign. The lessons learned during crises, such as Pugachev's rebellion, informed her approach, allowing her to govern with a combination of firmness and prudence that secured both stability and loyalty. Catherine's legacy was not limited to political and cultural achievements, it was also deeply personal. She had navigated an extraordinary life, rising from an uncertain and precarious position to become one of the most powerful women in European history. Her intelligence, ambition, and adaptability allowed her to transform potential vulnerabilities, her foreign origins, her youth, and the challenges of succession, into strengths. Through careful observation, patient strategy, and decisive action, she shaped the empire in ways that would endure for generations. In reflecting on Catherine's reign, it becomes clear that her influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her own time. The institutions she built, the reforms she implemented, and the cultural foundations she strengthened created an enduring framework for governance and intellectual life in Russia. Cities were transformed, armies modernized, and diplomacy conducted with an eye toward long-term advantage. Yet perhaps most importantly, she left behind a model of leadership defined by vision, intelligence, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances demanded. As she approached the end of her life, Catherine's rule had become both settled and admired. The empire she governed was stronger, more cohesive, and more respected than when she first ascended to the throne. Her death in 1796 marked the close of an era, but the structures, institutions, and cultural achievements she had fostered continued to shape Russia long after her passing. For those who look back on her reign, the story is one of transformation, of a young princess becoming an empress, of a nation strengthened and elevated, and of a ruler whose legacy continues to resonate through history. Catherine's story is, ultimately, a testament to the possibilities inherent in ambition guided by intellect, patience, and vision. She demonstrated that power is most enduring when combined with wisdom, and that leadership can leave a mark not only on the politics of a nation but also on its culture, its institutions, and its people. Her reign reminds us that extraordinary individuals, through courage, intellect, and careful strategy, can shape the course of history, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire reflection and admiration centuries later. And so, as the empire she nurtured continued to thrive, the memory of Catherine the Great remained, a quiet, powerful testament to one ruler's ability to transform both herself and the world around her, leaving behind a Russia that was stronger, richer, and more luminous than ever before. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Catherine the Great and the story of an empire transformed, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating history sleep stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an exploration of the remarkable figures who shaped our world. Drift into history with us and let the past guide your dreams.